like to call to order the City of Sonoma Special Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, September 4th. And with that, I would ask for Christina to give us a call to order.
Commissioner Barnett.
Here.
Commissioner Jansen.
Here.
Commissioner Willander.
Here.
Chair Felder.
Present.
Commissioner Bohar.
Here.
Commissioner McDonald.
Here.
Commissioner Cribb.
Here.
And Commissioner Corrado.
That would Commissioner Bohar lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do you know what the password is?
Just a couple of things. First of all, because this is a special meeting, members of the public will have an opportunity to address the Planning Commission on the item that's listed on the agenda during consideration of the item. But no other items will be discussed at this special meeting. And I would also ask all of you to please put your cell phones on silent mode so they don't interrupt us during the meeting. And there will be no decision reached tonight. It is a public hearing to solicit comments from both the public and commissioners concerning the project. So again, there will be no decision made at the end of the evening. With that, I assume since there's only one agenda item, there's no issues with the agenda order or anything else.
I would like to ask questions of the staff, and it's not related to the item on the agenda. So
And
you tell me.
We can't honor that because of the special meeting. There's no items
I
that
don't
can be
agree.
discussed.
I don't agree. There are questions of the staff that I think are very important for me to ask.
Then I will defer to our city attorney to answer that.
There's comments from the commission at the end.
So comments from the commission at the end of the agenda, you can ask. We're just not taking any public comment on items not on the agenda. So if you have comments from the commission at the end of the agenda for items, I assume these are items that are not related to tonight's comment period.
I have no items related to tonight that on the item on the agenda tonight. I have questions of the staff that I would like to have, and they are not comments, they are questions. So tell me when is the best time to ask those.
Do the questions require action by the commission, or are there just questions that you want staff to answer your individual questions?
The latter.
Then you can either contact staff separately offline, and staff can answer your questions either by email or telephone.
No, I want to have it here tonight. I want to have my questions answered tonight.
Well, you can ask your questions during council comment. I don't know whether or not the staff will be able to answer those questions, but you can ask your questions during commission comment at the end of the agenda.
When most people will have left, correct?
I can't speak to whether or not the individuals will have left towards the end of the agenda relative to that item. It will be your questions. The end of the agenda will be displayed online, certainly, so they'll have the opportunity to see or hear your questions by watching the tape. I'm not sure I understand you want the public to be able to hear your questions, is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Okay.
I do.
So if the commission is amenable to modifying the order of the agenda, you can do that at the beginning of the meeting.
I would like to modify the order of the agenda so that I can ask the very specific questions that I have.
Okay, if that would require a majority of the commission to go along with it, so I will take a roll call on that as to whether we will change the order of the agenda.
Commissioner Barnett.
Aye.
Commissioner Jansen.
Aye.
Commissioner Willander.
Aye.
Commissioner Bohar,
Aye.
Commissioner McDonald,
Aye.
Commissioner Cribb,
Nay.
Chair Felder.
Nay.
The motion passes 5-2.
Okay, with that, we will have a switch in the agenda order so that we will have comments from the commission, and you are on.
Okay. What I would like to know, and and I think it's really important for all of the members of the commission to know, is why we are, with you, Jim, okay? And I've done a lot of background research on you, okay? But why we had a planning director who resigned several months ago, and in the process, okay, was never replaced, with several months, that he could have been replaced, all right? And then we had an interim planning director who lasted 3 days and 1 meeting. I want to know what happened and why, because none of the members of the planning commission, to my knowledge, okay, and perhaps the chair has knowledge of it, but I don't know of anybody else that does, knows what happened. And I want to know what happened.
Well, I'm not sure that staff that's here can respond to this question. I will respond only to say, number one, as
I don't want a legal beagle. I want somebody who actually speaks regular English, okay? So I want somebody to speak to me who just answers the question honestly.
So I believe that you can certainly contact the city manager's office and speak to the city manager about this issue, but primarily relative to the personnel actions of the city, there may not be an answer that the city can give to you relative to personnel matters.
Jim, answer the question. Do you know?
Commissioner, I have to take the advice of the city attorney here, and what she has said, and I'm sorry, but rightfully so, is that it's a personnel matter, and those are generally confidential, unless revealed by the parties, I guess. I'm not sure what the parameters are, but yeah, I'd love to go into detail, but I'm afraid that I can't.
Okay. And so we were not notified as commission, to my knowledge, okay? And I take, forgive me if somebody on this planning commission was notified and I was not, all right? But the long and the short of it is, we were not notified of anything that was happening. And so I would like to know, okay, how you ended up being here and why you're only here for 2 days a week. I think you're a good guy. I've checked you out, okay? But I just want to know why we've got now a planning department that's comprised of one person who's there 2 days a week, okay? One person, associate planner, and a secretary or assistant, and nobody else. And contract planners, and that's it. And we have no idea how we're getting information or anything else. We're spending nothing but special sessions, okay? Which is fine, for me, but for people who actually work for a living and do special stuff, it's not so fine.
So, Mr. Chair, I think we're kind of delving into pretty
Yep.
deeply into items that aren't on the agenda this evening, and I would suggest that if the commission has questions about the staffing of the planning department, that you contact the city manager.
Okay. I think-
No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask the question and I want an answer.
I think they've answered you, Carol,
No, they haven't.
as much as they're able to.
No, they haven't.
I'm going to have to ask you to draw this to a close. I'm sorry.
Nope, I'm not going to. I want an answer to my question. Jim, I think you're the best person to answer it. Seriously, you are.
Again, I think the city attorney has given you what she can and what staff can. Commissioner, I'm sorry.
She's not the city attorney.
Well, I'm sorry. The representative of the city attorney has given you what the staff can give you this evening. And we can get back to you once we've spoken to the folks in the city to find out more about the transition and let you know what's coming, and happy to do that.
Okay.
I'll say one thing. I did just start last week, so, I apologize for.
I get that. So
coming
did
right in on you
Jim,
here.
so did
Yeah.
Jim Moore, okay? And said that he had just started, okay? And now he's off the plate after 3 days. So I want to know what is happening with the planning department in this city. Because we're sitting here and we're all volunteers, we get no pay, we get no benefits, we get no salary, okay? All we're doing is sitting here spinning our wheels. And I can tell you right now, that's what we're doing. Because we don't have anybody to follow up, follow through, or anything else.
Well, I've answered your question, Commissioner. I'm sorry, to the best of my ability this evening. I apologize.
Commissioner Jansen, I'm going to have to ask you to wind it up now. You've had as much of an answer as you're going to get this evening, and I'm sorry that it doesn't satisfy you, but we're going to move on to the next item.
It does not satisfy
I
me.
realize that, but we're going to move on. So can you please let me know what late correspondence has come in?
Excuse me, Chair, is this not commission comments? I mean, I
All
don't
right.
want to forfeit,
Yes.
that's why I voted
Yes.
against it.
All right.
I mean, at this point, I just want to say, I mean, Commissioner Jansen's concerns aside, I mean, I don't think we are just spinning our wheels up here. We have we have a full commission present. We have a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge here, particularly on tonight's topic. I know that nearly all of us have been involved in this project in one way or another, absent Commissioner Jansen since 2012, whether on design review and historic preservation or on the Planning Commission. So I'd like to make the point that I don't think we are spinning our wheels. And I'm not negating the validity of her question. I just want to make it clear to the public that I believe that there's still validity in this hearing tonight, and that we continue with this, and that there's no spinning of wheels going on, that this is actually a productive and important session that we have.
With all due candor, Commissioner Cribb, everything we do that's of substance gets appealed to City Council. So that doesn't tell me that as a commission, we're acting in any way, shape, or form that gives any possibility to the public that they are actually going to live by whatever it is that we do. That's what we do. We just sit here and we act on something, and then it gets appealed to the City Council, and then whatever happens, happens. And I think that's pretty obvious.
I think we've gotten to the point that if this matter needs to be discussed, we can call a special meeting, it can be noticed, and we can have that discussion, but I don't think we're going to get anywhere tonight with carrying it any further. So I'd like to draw it to a close, and
Then call a special meeting, and let's do that. Because I think it's really important that what we do here, okay, no matter what it is about, okay, and this has nothing to do with the item on the agenda tonight, which I told you, okay? I firmly believe that we have to discuss, as a commission, with the council, what are we doing here?
I will make a request for a special meeting.
Well, don't make a request, make it beyond a
I will
request.
entertain one more comment from Commissioner Barnett,
Well,
and
my
I'm going to move on.
To follow up on Commissioner Cribb's point, is this the commissioner comment time?
Yes.
So we won't have another commissioner comment at the end? Which we can.
We can.
Because if this is commissioner comment time, I would like to use it as commissioner comment time.
I
But I would prefer to do it
like
at the end.
I would like to have another commissioner comment time at the end, if that's permissible on the agenda.
You can continue this item down to the end if
Thank
you would
you.
like to, and the commission agrees.
I would
like to continue.
at the end.
I'd like to continue comments from the commission until after the issues update.
Second.
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Okay. Passes 7-0. Late correspondence.
Yes, we have a number of letters we've received and emails that relate to this evening's item on the agenda.
Okay, we will then move on to the next item, which is the public hearing for comments on the revised environmental impact report relating to the use permit and site design architectural review for the Hotel Sonoma project, which consists of a 62-room hotel, 80-seat restaurant and spa, 115 off-street parking spaces, and potential off-site parking. With that, I will ask Mr. Reese to give us a start with the staff report and then introduce others as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, members of the Commission, my name is Jim Reese. I'm a special advisor for Management Partners and been brought on by the city to help with this project. Next to me is representative of the City Attorney's Office, Ms. Nebb, and next to her is Mr. Steve Nowak. He is a representative of PlaceWorks, the environmental consultant on this project, and he'll be making a presentation in just a minute. I just wanted to real briefly say that this evening we're looking at a revised draft environmental impact report. It was prepared to evaluate the physical impacts on the project environment of this given project here. And tonight's hearing is being held to accept public comments on that document. It should be noted that comment is limited to the information contained in that document, not the entire record on the environmental process. Comments on the document received during the comment period, which ends September 13th, should be in writing or at this hearing and be responded to by the environmental consultant in response to comments in the final environmental impact report. The draft environmental impact report, final EIR, revised draft EIR, and revised final EIR will together form the environmental review and record and CEQA compliance documents for the proposed project. What I'd like to do now is turn the podium or the microphone over to Mr. Nowak with PlaceWorks, and he'll give us a brief description of the document that you're looking at this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Steve Nowak. I'm a principal with PlaceWorks and the principal in charge for this project. I'm going to do a very brief presentation tonight, talk about the revised EIR process, next steps, the appeal and recirculated draft, and then an overview of the contents of the document, and then how to submit a public comment. And in terms of project history, this is also in your staff report, but we just wanted to lay out kind of the sequence of events that have led up to this hearing tonight, and that was including the upheld appeal of the resolution of the Planning Commission certification of the document in April, and then direction to prepare the revised EIR. In terms of the process, this EIR is a very focused document. We only looked at a few issues specifically as directed by the council. We issued a notice of preparation for the 45-day public comment period, and we're in the middle of that comment period that ends on September 13th. We will then prepare the final EIR, which will include the response to comments, any changes to this document that's necessary, and any revisions to the mitigation, monitoring, and reporting plan that would be necessary. And then this will come back to the Planning Commission for a certification hearing, and it would go to council if it is appealed. So again, 45-day public review period, and then the tentative date for the Planning Commission certification hearing would be October 4th. We looked at, in terms of changes to the document, the following sections were changed, including the executive summary, the introduction to explain the context of this revised document, the project description. We looked at cultural resources in terms of any impacts of the proposed bulb outs on the historic district of the Sonoma Square. We revised the transportation and traffic section. We looked at land use and planning issue of the housing policy and the requirement for that on this site. And then we also looked at additional alternatives to the project. And I want to note that a little editorial about CEQA. We are writing to very specific thresholds. Those thresholds are outlined in the CEQA guidelines, and they're very black and white in terms of addressing those thresholds. So many times we will hear comments about environmental issues, and in the eyes of the speaker, in the eyes of others, they are environmental issues with a little e. But in terms of how we need to look at issues as defined by CEQA, we are looking very specifically to those thresholds, and those thresholds are in each of the chapters, and that's what we determine whether or not there's a potential for an impact or not. So it is a very defined process, and I just want to note that in terms of how it works. Let's see, I think that, again, the EIO, I'll present the overview real quickly. The summary itself provides a summary of the content of the documents, including discussion of the project alternatives, the impacts and mitigation measures. The introduction, again, is looking at the changes that were brought about as requested by the council and how that fits into the overall project. We added the new features in the project description itself, and in the environmental analysis, again, we looked at 3 major areas and then revisions to the alternatives. So, and then we added additional appendices as well. All of these will become part of the administrative record, including the previous document as well as this one. Again, the public comment, the period closes on the 13th. This is, we do encourage written comments as well as the comments presented tonight, and this is where to send comments. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Before we go out to the public, are there questions of staff?
Thank you. I had a couple questions, more kind of broad brushed. The council directed staff to amend and change and recirculate the EIR. But does that give the public and also the commission the opportunity to, now that it is open for discussion, to look at the alternates that might be looked at, or maybe even hybrids, or are we just required to kind of like a straitjacket, so to speak, like we can't talk about anything other than what is before us, or can we make comments to make changes to, say, for example, the alternates or alternatives, or a hybrid, and then also, again, it seems to me like, again, being in a straitjacket, not being able to look at the other parts of the EIR that have not been presented in the packet. There's a lot of the commission that wasn't privy to or part of the original public hearing, and I just want to understand, in terms of CEQA law, if we have now opened the EIR up again for discussion, and that includes the parts of the traffic analysis that are not included in this draft, the visual impact analysis that was not included in this draft, the rationale for the traffic studies that's not included in this draft, and also information that was late to our commission back last year with an additional parking lot and some additional changes and modifications to the project description that, in a sense, threw the project up in the air and required it to go back to the drawing board. So in a verbose way, what I'm asking is, can we discuss items that are not included in this amended or focused draft EIR?
I think I'm up on that one. So the answer is yes, but it's a bifurcated yes. Sorry about that. The agenda item for tonight is to take comments on this revised draft EIR. Ultimately, the commission will have the full of the environmental document in front of it. However, when you have the project in front of you, and you will have the opportunity to address the full of that environmental document, you will have the opportunity at that point to certify, to decline to certify, to ask for additional information, or whatever it is that you want to do relative to the environmental document when you consider that document prior to considering the project on its merits. Ultimately, the commission has, for lack of a better word, control of this project back. It was referred back to you for this purpose. You never took any action on the project itself, only on the environmental document, and then that action was appealed. So both the environmental document and the project itself will be back before you at the close of the comment period. If there's some comment that the commission wants to make about this revised document, certainly you can do that this evening. And ask whatever questions you need to ask or want to ask about that may be able to be addressed in the response to comments document. So you have some opportunity tonight, but you will have the full opportunity to review the whole of the document and take your action on that document when it comes back before you at the close of the comment period once the revised response to comments, revised final document is prepared.
And one final question. If there is information or where the commission feels comfortable having another public hearing or given more time to absorb, say for example we ask a question or for additional information that needs to be vetted and looked at, and it may not necessarily happen on October 4th. Say for example it might take more time than October 4th. That's like basically 2 weeks of getting back to what the issue might be, and then, public notice and whatnot. I'm just wondering, is there an opportunity for us to continue this if we feel that we don't have enough information to, say, for example, October 4th to continue this particular analysis of this particular document?
So the comment period ends when the comment period ends as specified in the notice. The commission will have an opportunity at your merits hearing, for lack of a better word, on the document itself to continue that meeting if you feel you need additional time either to review the document or to ask some additional questions. To the extent that you believe that you need additional time this evening, I don't know if we have additional time within the comment period to schedule another meeting. Staff can confer about that and see if there's an opportunity to do that. We have been somewhat constrained in, as the commission noted previously, we've had some special meetings in order to address scheduling issues among both the commission staff and the meeting room being used for other purposes. So, but we can look at that and let you know before the end of the meeting.
We were just like a little spoiled from David because he would put together a very detailed staff report saying what we can and can't do, and
right,
and we don't have that. So
understood.
So
yeah.
Thank you for your patience.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I have a follow-up question to Commissioner McDonald's, and they're similar, but I just maybe for a point of clarification. The first one is, for example, you have a certification hearing scheduled for October 4th. If there are elements in the draft EIR that's not part of the revised EIR that some of us may think need some work or some suggestions, etc., would it be better to bring that up tonight so it can be included by October 4th? Does that make any sense in a more sort of expedient, like why, I mean, should I wait until October 4th to bring up, in my view, an issue with aesthetics that could delay it on October 4th, or should I bring that up tonight?
We certainly are. The meeting is noticed as a comment meeting on the revised draft, but you're correct that if you have concerns relative to the base document, the original draft, that weren't previously brought up and weren't brought up by the city council and therefore weren't incorporated into the revised draft such that we're going to get to the next hearing and you're going to be concerned about certifying the document, which is, I think, maybe what you're saying. Certainly, I think you can let staff know what those items are, and staff can evaluate whether or not they can be addressed in the response to comments document. In some ways, they can. This is your time to comment. If they can be addressed, then there's a possibility that they would be addressed. If they can't, then staff will have to get back to you on what that really means in the scheme of things.
Okay. And then how soon after the last sort of public hearing we had during a comment period was the certification meeting scheduled? Or maybe this is a question for the CEQA consultant, is a month typical? I mean, are you going to have enough time to incorporate all the comments and questions?
Yeah, I planned ahead, and I'm aware of the constrained time and the ability, and we have my team set up to do that, so that's not.
Is that a typical turnaround?
Yeah, it really depends on the city and, the project itself. We've done turnarounds that quickly before.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions of staff?
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that it may be a little presumptuous to think that the final hearing will be October 4th, given that we haven't heard all comments, and I would like to think that should we feel uneasy that October 4th is just too soon, that we have the opportunity to suggest a deferred date.
You certainly do, and staff did anticipate that it might take the commission more than one meeting to get through both the environmental document and the project as a whole. And we anticipated that there may be a second date necessary and had planned for that eventuality.
Does anybody else have any questions? Because I'd like to ask a couple.
I have one question.
Okay, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Yeah, and I just want to get this clarified before we go into the public comment period, because I anticipate it will come up, because I know it was at the crux of a lot of the correspondence we received prior to this. And I just want to double check my interpretation versus the public's interpretation. A number of the people, were relative to the whole issue of the 50% residential component required in a commercial, were implying or using the direct language that it was somehow an absolute requirement. When I've read the code, I don't see that. I still see it as a discretionary item for the commission, and I don't know if we can get an absolute legal opinion on this, but I just like kind of a general concept, because the way I read it is that it's still a discretionary item, that it's not an absolute requirement.
I'll try to answer that question for you. It is not an absolute requirement as stated in your code. It is a requirement stated in your code with a process for granting a deviation from that requirement. That process can be granted by the Planning Commission or on appeal to City Council. It is described in the land use section of the environmental document, the process, as well as the applicable code section.
Yeah, and I guess the piece of that is the phrase where but are not limited to. So that means it doesn't have to meet those exact 4 criteria. It could be any other criteria that the commission might determine would either require or not require.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, a couple of questions, okay? To the city attorney's assistant, okay? Let me ask you a question. When was the last time that this particular EIR was first became before the Planning Commission? Because I wasn't on it, and probably several members were not of the Planning Commission, were not on it at the time. When was the last time that it was submitted to the city?
Based on the date, I don't remember independently, but in the staff report for your item this evening, it cites April 13th of 2017 as the date the Planning Commission voted to certify the original final EIR.
Okay, and then it went on appeal to City Council, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so 2017, April 2017, we're now seeing it in September 2018, okay? In a revised form. So tell me how that meets any kind of CEQA law. I just want to know if it meets CEQA law.
It does.
Tell me how.
Well, because the environmental document having been reviewed, circulated, appealed, and referred back to the Planning Commission with specific direction from the City Council is part of the process anticipated under CEQA, where changes are made to the environmental document as a result of new information or new requirements. Then that document is required to be recirculated under CEQA if you are making substantial changes, which a determination was made that the changes were substantial.
Right.
The recirculation was complied with. We are now in the comment period for that recirculated information. That information will then be responded to in a response to comments document.
Okay, but it was resubmitted in July.
Yes.
Am I correct? Okay, so
What, I don't understand resubmitted in July,
Okay.
what that means.
it was resubmitted to the city of Sonoma in July.
No, the City Council made its determination that the environmental document needed to come back, but the document...
It was resubmitted according to the staff report in July to David Goodison.
In July, the applicant made a request that they basically agreed that they wanted additional information, including additional alternatives included, and the document was referred back to staff for amendments to the environmental document. That is correct. So the council took its action on the appeal. The applicant submitted a letter essentially saying, yes, we agree, we would like to see additional alternatives included in the document and additional information on traffic. The council took its vote in July, and it was referred back to the staff and the environmental consultant for preparation of the revised environmental document. That is correct.
So in your opinion, it meets all CEQA requirements?
Well, if you're asking me if the process meets the requirements, my answer to that is yes.
That's what I asked.
Yes.
Okay, then I have another question. Jim Reese, okay? My question to you is this, okay? I've got new glasses here, guys, so bear with me here. All the options under the EIR, okay? Are they all permissible within the development code that would stay at the Planning Commission unless appealed to the City Council?
I'm not sure, Commissioner, but I'll be glad to find out and get back to you on that.
I don't want to get back. I want to know now.
I can't answer that question.
I apologize. We'll have to get back to you, Commissioner. Sorry.
Okay.
Certainly, just to further up on that answer, before the project is in front of you, the staff report for the project, when the project comes in front of you, can address the question of whether or not, let's just say, one of the alternatives in the document the commission preferred over the project as proposed, if that's an option, if that's...
That's not my ask. That's
Well,
not
your
my
ask is
question.
whether or not the commission has jurisdiction over all of the alternatives in the project.
That's correct.
Is your direct question.
That's correct.
And so the staff report, when the project principle is in front of you for a decision, will contain the answer to that question.
I have another question to follow up on a couple of these. But before I do, will the historic consultant and traffic consultant be here on October 4th? And why are they not here tonight?
They're not here tonight because we're not talking about the contents of the document. We're just here to take comments.
So if I ask a question about the traffic analysis, it's just put into the record?
That's correct. And then we'll provide...
And he'll be here on October 4th?
We'll provide the response in the document itself then. We'll have a...
Okay.
And the historic consultant, the traffic consultant will be here on the 4th. The historic consultant will not.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. My other question follows up on Commissioner Cribb's question about the residential component. And is this, are the 4 reasons why we're allowed to waive a residential component that are listed in the municipal code, is that similar to findings when a commission or the city council has to make findings? Or is there any relation?
Only a little is my answer to that question.
Go on.
Because the statute was written in a manner that allowed the city as a whole, whether commission with jurisdiction or council with jurisdiction, to waive the requirement for the 4 listed reasons and other reasons, then yes, findings must be made that articulate the reasons you're making the waiver, but they aren't limited to the 4 listed.
Right.
So yes, they are findings in that specifically the action would have to describe the why.
Right. So is there a threshold for example, it says 4 fairly detailed reasons why we're allowed to waive, but then as Commissioner Cribb points out, it says, but are not limited to. So would reason number 5 have to meet a certain threshold, or could it be similar to the other 4, or could it be just simply, we don't want to?
It could be similar to the other 4. It could be different from the other 4. It could be a finding that, and again, I'm not making any of these findings, so I don't really want to make specific suggestions, but it could relate to whether or not residential is considered to be appropriate and compatible in this area. It could be addressed to the question of whether or not.
So a substantial reason has to be offered.
I think a reason has to. I think a reason has to be offered. The code doesn't necessarily use the word substantial, but I think you define it when you make the finding, or determine not to make the finding, and if it goes on appeal, then the council does the same. So it would. The majority of the commission
but a
would
reason
be,
will have to be stated.
A reason does have to be stated.
Okay.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Just a short follow-up about that meeting on October 4th. That's a Thursday, if I had that right? And has that been set certain? I was unaware that it was certainly set.
Can I? Yeah. If you notice in the slide presentation, we put tentative on there. We did check with the commission to find out if folks would be available, and it hasn't been advertised yet, but that's what we're targeting right now.
So the meeting is tentative. It's
Yes.
set for the 4th, which is a Thursday.
That's correct.
And the other part of it is, it sounded like it was not certain to be announced that it was a voting meeting on the EIR and the CUP. It could be a discussion and continuance, but it's not set. How's that going to work?
The notice for the meeting that goes out will ultimately go out as a public hearing notice with both actions, the potential for both actions described, action on the environmental document and action on the project entitlements. If you do not conclude at that meeting, then the meeting will be continued to a date certain where you will have the opportunity to make that conclusion at that date.
Let me interrupt here for a minute. My correspondence that I received indicated that the meeting room was busy on October 4th. We were asked to respond to a October 2nd or October 3rd date, and the majority of the commission was available on October 3rd, and I believe that was the most recent date that's been put forth for the meeting. And I was under the impression that that was certain.
Yes, I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I believe we found that October 3rd, to contradict what I just said, was a better date for the commission. So I believe that's what we're going to be advertising for. That's correct, yes.
Because
So,
this room
yes.
is not available
Yeah,
on the 4th.
we've had a lot of confusion this month about September 3rd, 4th, and October 3rd, 4th, and but it is at this point tentative for October 3rd. So,
All right.
yes, thank you.
Well, I mean, just a suggestion, why wouldn't we just have it at our typical planning commission meeting in October? You know, a week, October 11th.
I agree.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I apologize. The staff is not available October 11th, unfortunately.
Yeah, I believe we have canceled the meeting of October 11th.
That's correct.
and
Can we run our own?
Proposed it to October 18th. It's hard to keep track of all these dates.
That's my fault. I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Other question?
So
if-
let me ask a question, okay? So basically, the planning commission can't have it on a regularly scheduled meeting because the staff isn't available? Is that the case? Am I hearing it correctly?
At this point, that is the case, Commissioner, yes.
Are we going to continue with questions, or are we going to open it up to public comment?
Just one more question.
All right.
Just for clarification, because it has to do with the project scope and prior analysis. So my understanding that the height requirements that we allow projects to be 3 stories or taller, because typically, my understanding in the zoning district is because if there's a residential component, and this is a question that I had brought up, I guess last year, the project that's before us is 100% commercial. It's a hotel with a restaurant, and I wanted to understand what allows a project that's 100% commercial hotel with restaurant to go forward as a 3-story proposal when the zoning code says that you can have up to 3 stories if there's a residential component.
So I'm probably going to need to defer to Wendy behind us here for a recitation of the code, but my understanding is there are 2 sections of the code that address themselves to height increases. One has to do with the residential component, the other does not, and I'll let Wendy speak to that.
Do have the code in front of me, but not that section, so just one moment, please.
Thank you very much. I think so, yeah. Thank you very much. Jim, maybe you can answer it.
The section of the municipal code that deals with exceptions to height limits states that additional height of or roof area may be allowed subject to the approval of an exception in compliance with the exceptions section of the development code.
Wait, can I? Sorry.
Maybe somebody wanted that.
So there's a 1940.040 height measurement and height limit exceptions. It says within the commercial, gateway commercial, and mixed-use zoning districts, a maximum height of 36 feet may be allowed in order to accommodate third-floor multifamily residential development. The allowance of this additional height is subject to use permit review.
So there are 2 different exception sections. That's one, and then Wendy just read you the other one that's 2 sections down.
So if they're conflicting,
They're not conflicting, there's just two reasons that you can grant additional height. The first being for 3rd-floor residential with a use permit, the second being additional height with the exception findings.
so it is an exception.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, yes, that's the reason you can add additional height. I don't know what the base height is in this district, and I don't have that in front of me at the moment, but we can look it up if you would like.
Thank you.
I have a question. okay? To Jim Reese, okay? When you stated before that the staff was not available, okay, on October, I can't recall the date, but it doesn't matter, all right? Our regular meeting, you said that the staff was not available. So who you're talking about in terms of staff? Since you're a two-day person.
Right, I'm included in that, as well as other staff members who may be needed for the meeting that evening. They're either gone or unavailable that night, unfortunately. And that's part of the reason why we initially pulled the commission to see if they were available on the 3rd or the 4th, because of that problem on the 11th.
Okay. I think it's very important, okay, to note that what days are you available to meet? What days are you?
What days am I available to meet?
Yeah.
Well, not that week, but certainly the 3rd or the 4th or the 18th.
Is the 18th a regular meeting for the Planning Commission?
Let me remind you that we're in questions of staff concerning this agenda item, and I think we're getting kind of far away from that.
I'm asking a question and I want it answered.
Chairman, what is your direction, sir?
Commissioner Jansen, you're not going to get a further answer tonight, so I'm going to have to ask you to put that aside.
I want an answer. What times are you available, Jim Reese, for a Planning Commission meeting on this item when it comes up?
I'm going to call an end to the public, or to the questions of staff at this point and open up the public hearing. I would like, yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I just, in response to Commissioner Barnett's question, Wendy did look up the base height limitation in the district, and it's 35 feet.
And as we move into the public hearing, if the applicant would like to give comments, just a minute, please. I'm going to allow you to have 10 minutes if you need it. And for the rest of the public, for your public comments, we will set the timer, but I'm going to allow 5 minutes tonight rather than the customary 3, because I want to be fair to those of you who have been showed up and have this long and arduous process on this project to have a chance to say whatever you need to say. So with that, with the applicant would like to step forward, and please state your name and address.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I'm Bill Hooper, the project applicant with Kinwood Investments at 144 West Napa Street. Been coming here a long time, probably since 2012 when we first started to review our proposal. At that time, there were significant questions about the project, a lot of public comment, and as a result, over the years, a lot of changes to our project, significantly downsized, significant changes to the architecture. And those hearings didn't just include the Planning Commission, they also included design review and other sort of community hearings, as well as the Sonoma Valley Citizens Advisory Commission. So a lot of comments, not to mention a public ballot initiative process. A lot of comments, a lot of input to our project, and a lot of changes in the project over the years. We agreed that an EIR was appropriate for this and agreed to fund it because there was just a lot of conjecture and a lot of non-facts being thrown around. What's good about an EIR is it's done by your consultant with experts in their field with no skin in the game. So highly credentialed people. And I would just remind you that this is an objective analysis, not guided by the applicant. One side note about the parking. The we presented a parking study to the Planning Commission hearing was originally to ratify the EIR or certify the EIR and then have the use permit hearing. Parking was not subject matter of the EIR. It became that when our parking study done by an independent consultant said the 115 spaces that we're proposing aren't enough on certain peak days, not every day, but certain peak days and peak times. And we offered another property that we own across the street. That triggered the need to do some study on the traffic involving how traffic would move in and out of that parking lot. So parking is still not the subject of the EIR, only to the extent that it impacted traffic movement. And so this is one of the revisions that was addressed and was asked to be addressed by the City Council to this EIR. For the residential alternatives, we were asked to provide a little bit of information on the 50-50 analysis. We offered that a typical residential unit would be around 800 square feet, where our hotel rooms are only 450 square feet. We provided that data to sort of guide staff and the consultant on the analysis of that alternative. And then lastly, we were asked if we were just adding residential, how much could we fit on the lot? We provided that information of the 8-unit option. And later in the process, we provided some illustrations on how that would fit on the property. So other than that, that's been the extent of our involvement in this revision of the EIR. And again, the EIR was certified by the Planning Commission. The City Council and we agreed that there was questions left unanswered, which is what's before you today, which is there weren't enough alternatives studied, and there were a lot of questions on traffic, and so we were in full agreement with the opponents of the project that we would take the time and the resources to support that, and here we are a year later. So I'm here for any questions you might have of the applicant later. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. With that, would other members of the public care to speak? And again, you have up to 5 minutes if you need that much time.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Larry Barnett, 637 5th Street East. I was one of the appellants on this matter, and I'm speaking to you tonight as an individual. The appeal has been heard. We're kind of back at the beginning of this process again. I'm got to express some confusion as to why it took so long for this revision to take place. If I were the applicant, I'd wonder why, particularly since the applicant is paying for it. But nonetheless, that's what's happened. What surprises me is that over the course of that year, relatively little has changed. The alternatives have been included in the language of the revision, and the door was opened to actually consideration of the floor plans for the 8-unit addition to the project. I say the door was open because there's nothing comparable to that regarding the impacts on this project of a 50-50 housing hotel mix. Now, as you know, as a commission, a residential development is subject to its own set of conditions and requirements that have impacts on matters of design and layout and access, and all of these questions still remain and have not been addressed in the EIR. For example, a residence has to have access to some kind of personal open space, a deck or a little porch or an outside courtyard or something like that. The questions of how would a 50-50 arrangement work if units were incorporated into the structure of the building. Obviously, you're not going to have tenants walking through the hotel lobby probably to get to their residences, although that might be the case We don't know what that would look like because we have no design information whatsoever about how this would happen. Now, why is this relevant? It pertains in part, and the consultant mentioned the waiver provisions that they outline in the document. This pertains in part to this matter of this waiver, because how on earth will this commission, or ultimately perhaps the city council, come to any determination about a waiver without information about what the impact or the appearance or the changes or the design implications of a residential component of 50% might be? So that's one concern. Another concern I have, and I've put some of this in a letter earlier to the commission, has to do with the bulb out on Napa Street. I have some concerns about this idea from a historic resource standpoint. But more significantly, looking back over the course of this year, this was a perfect opportunity to test whether the bulb out idea is even practical or what the effects of it might be. And yet, none of that's been done. We're now dealing with an abstract a set of hypotheticals about a bulb out, when in fact we could have taken a month or two of this past year, with Caltrans permission for an encroachment, used temporary curbing, which is readily available. You can go online and look up bulb out materials, and there's composite bulb out materials that are readily available. We could have actually tested what is the impact on pedestrian crossing, what's the impact on the traffic on Napa Street, what is the effect on truck turning in, south onto First Street West from Napa Street. What are the design configurations that would have to be considered? None of that was done. So instead, we're just going to guess. We're going to use our imaginations as to what this would be like, when in fact there's been an opportunity to actually investigate it. It wasn't done. I don't really understand that. I also have great concerns about this use of First Street West as the loading dock for this hotel. I mentioned this, and it was mentioned during the appeal. I don't understand, and there's a lot about this project I don't understand, but if you're going to scrape a parcel clean of all of its existing buildings and start fresh, why on earth would you not include a loading dock? Why would you essentially limit this project's viability to the willingness of the city to sacrifice a portion of the public street for a loading function for a private business? To me, it's unheard of. And to compare it with what goes on in the plaza with historic pre-existing businesses with no parking at all just simply doesn't make any sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Jerry Bernhout. I live in Oakmont. I'm an environmental attorney. The primary interest I have in the impacts discussed in the EIR is greenhouse gas emissions. Specifically, the failure to address long-range emissions from air travel. Nothing we do as individuals pumps carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Excuse me just for a minute. Would you set the timer, please? Thank you.
Nothing we do as individuals pumps carbon dioxide into the atmosphere faster than air travel. The revised hotel EIR maintains the same refusal to account for GHG emissions from long-range vehicle miles traveled as did the prior EIR. The revised EIR continues to claim that the operational phase of the project would not exceed Air Quality Management District significance criteria. This fiction can only be maintained by excluding emissions from long-range vehicle miles traveled. The DEIR also justifies this by saying that the project itself is not likely to have been the only reason for aircraft travel. I would like to see any lawyer try to argue that in court. Anything to keep the wheels of commerce rolling without taking responsibility for the impacts. There are protocols to track and attribute these emissions, even to multiple destinations, if there was a good faith interest in full disclosure. I was the lead attorney in the case that overturned the County Climate Action Plan exactly on the same grounds of failing to account for long distance travel from local projects. there is every reason to believe the same legal arguments will prevail at the individual project level. These land use decisions at the municipal level have profound global impacts. Local governments have the power, through the permitting process, to at least demand an honest accounting of the true impacts of the project they approve. CEQA demands it. Now, we also, and let me also say that I'm here tonight speaking on behalf of California River Watch. That was the group I represented in the Climate Action Plan case. I'll submit written comments that address other issues. Also, I'd like to say, contrary to this advice you got from staff, thresholds of significance are not dispositive in a CEQA action. Courts can find significant impacts even if a project arguably satisfies thresholds of significance. And I'll submit some additional comments, and I'll include citations of cases that found that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, thank you for your time. Regina Baker, First Street West in Sonoma. So I have been following this for a year. Now I want to get this straight. There's still going to be a 62-room hotel with 8 additional residential units. Is that correct?
No.
What is?
The 8 residential is an alternative.
So,
and there would be some reduction in the number of rooms, I believe. But we'll let the project applicant speak to that if they need to.
okay, well, the sentiment of Sonoma is, the residents, is that you will be spinning your wheels if you don't have at least 40 to 50% residential units. You will be spinning your wheels because it will go to the council, and you will see this room packed like you've never seen it packed before. And that's a guarantee. So if you don't want to spin your wheels, go back. You know, Kenwood Investments might just make more money just putting up all residential. So we don't want to, we want to see them make money. We like them in town, but they also are working with, honorably with the residents of Sonoma. So it's up to you whether you want to spin your wheels or not. Thank you.
My name is Judy Young, 263 Chase. So I want to speak as another resident of Sonoma who feels entirely different than the lady that just spoke. A lot of people, when we haven't done a good job of coming out to these meetings, so I'm trying to educate myself on this. I'm pretty appalled at the dirty laundry that was shared at the beginning of the meeting. Excuse me, shaking. And I just think this whole process is such a mess. And I am all for, my husband and I are all for good quality, necessary, appropriate growth, appropriate improvements with all, you know, checking the environment, doing the traffic studies and all that. But guys, this is a hotel. We need hotels. This is a quality, high-end, necessary hotel in this town to service our community as a hotel. It's not an apartment building. I would not want to stay in a $600 hotel room with kids jumping over my head. It's stupid. And we can't, I mean, how much would those apartments be? We're not talking about affordable housing, which we need. We're talking about, I don't know what. But, and I live in town. I'm in my car 4 or 5 times a day, running in and out. You think that's not going to be a problem? You want 50 apartments, tiny little apartments with people doing their little chores in and out of town? It's going to make it worse. Let it be what it needs to be. People complain about VRBOs, complain about the noise. The hotel industry is all for this. Guys, we need it. Let it be a hotel. You're going to scare, I can't believe the patience and the understanding and the wherewithal of this developer to try to appeal to the numerous, one appeal after the other. You fix one and it's like a fingers in the dike. They got another one. It's ridiculous. I mean, we need a hotel. You got a builder, they're not building a Holiday Inn. They're building a nice damn hotel in this town. You want the tax base higher? You need parking. Put it on another, raise the TOT, I think it's called, tax. Build a parking lot behind the barracks. You want traffic to move? Put a better pedestrian traffic path in front of EDK and Summervine. Fix those problems. Those are the mess. It's parking and traffic. It's not the hotel. I'm appalled, and believe me, I speak here as myself, but this is cocktail conversation around, and this is not, my opinion is not a single opinion. We're disgusted with the negativity and the slowing down of good quality projects with the proper due diligence. Thank you.
Thank you.
David Eicher, 1110 Loma Court. So anything with residential, the city does require 20% affordable. So if you had 25 units, then you would have some affordable units within that. And as you see in we don't have a design for the 50-50 alternative, but for the 8-unit alternative, it was a separate building, wasn't over your head of the people in the hotels. And this hotel does have impacts to traffic as identified by the traffic consultant in the traffic studies. Now, whether there are enough significant or not is up for some debate, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But first, there was some inconsistency. It looks like the IT also just only read the executive summary on the 50-50, where the executive summary says there's 25 hotel rooms, but in section 6.2 in the alternatives, it says there's 37 hotel rooms. So which is it? The IT says the restaurant is to remain because it's not specified in the executive summary. However, in section 6.2, it says the hotel is going to be removed. The executive summary also says that it'll increase the size, overall square footage of the buildings by almost 9,000 square feet. I don't think that's accurate. I think it still increases by my calculations, but maybe not by that much if you remove the hotel. And the 50-50 alternative is not what was requested by the city council. They did not ask for removal of the restaurant. They were told by the assistant city attorney that the details would be chosen such that the environmental impact is reduced. You can look at the video, about 58 minutes into the video, and you'll see the whole explanation of how the consultant will do some iterations to see that the environmental impact of the alternative is reduced. That's not completely the case here. As mentioned, the overall square footage is increased. The understanding was it's going to be the same square footage, 50-50. The residential component, as it right now shows, is about 10,000 square feet short of 50%. The hotel rooms are 450 square feet in the alternative, but 480 square feet in the proposed project because you have suites and ADAs and queen doubles, which are larger in size than the standard hotel rooms. The residential units are much smaller than the recently approved apartments, including the Taub and Oliva apartments, which average 780 square feet for a one-bedroom and 1,130 square feet for a two-bedroom. And the residential units in the 50-50 alternative are also smaller than the 8 residential unit alternative. The 8 residential alternative would be about 960 square feet, averaging in 1 and 2 bedroom units, not 800 square feet. So we don't have the details. It sounds like the developer chose some of the sizes of the hotel rooms, the number of, of the residential units and the size of them. And then the consultant just took that and didn't really look at how best to fit that in to, for the environmental impact on that. Some other errors. The DEIR used 2.13 persons per household, and that's wrong because that number includes 3 and 4 bedroom ones. These is only 1 and 2 bedrooms. For Sonoma area, the Census Bureau has 1.17 persons per household in one-bedroom units and 1.75 in two-bedroom units. And I will send detailed links of all this later on in my written comments so you can be verified. So the Census Bureau numbers should be used when for this because that impacts the number of residents and a number of other environmentals. So if a properly designed 50-50 alternative would have been used, would have reduced environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas, VMT, pedestrian risk, vehicle congestion, and parking in residential neighborhoods, which is a CEQA concern. The method for the proposed project now, as opposed to the alternatives, for the impact of pedestrians on traffic, they use a method called a peak hour factor to implement looking at that.
Thank you, David. Your time's up.
Okay. However, this is a bad model, and I'll tell you why in my comment.
Good evening. I'm Johanna Patri. I live at 621 Napa Road. The project is proposed over 4 separate legal lots. The EIR mentions that to perfect the project, a lot line adjustment is required. I purport that this lot line adjustment, which requires its own application, needs to be included as part of the whole of the action under CEQA. The Subdivision Map Act requires that findings must be made that a lot line adjustment conforms to a general plan and the zoning ordinance. Furthermore, I question as to whether the use of 4 legal underlying parcels for one development requires under the Subdivision Map Act a parcel map application as part of the whole of the action, which would then merge these 4 parcels into one underlying parcel. The EIR does not sufficiently address with plans an approximately 50% housing component and 50% commercial component as required by the Sonoma Development Code and as required by the City Council Resolution 43-2017, unless the requirement is waived by the Planning Commission. This requirement has not been waived and cannot be waived until the merits of the project are discussed. Without a full analysis under the CEQA review process, you will not have adequate information to analyze the merits of the 50-50 housing requirement. This requires floor plans, parking, exterior architectural details, code requirements, etc. I find it odd, maybe even biased, that the EIR has floor plans for 8 residential unit alternative, but there is no basis put forth under CEQA review the 50% housing requirement should be waived. In addition, in conformance with the general plan policies envision, quote, housing that is available and affordable to the residents and the local workforce to support an economically diverse population. CEQA requires sufficient information about each alternative to allow meaningful evaluation, analysis, and comparison with the proposed project. The EIR slides over the use of an off-site parcel on the north side of Highway 12, the Bank of Marin property, as part of the proposed project. It states that the use of this parcel is a, quote, recommended condition of approval. What approval? There is no adopted resolution with conditions of approval. Caltrans' understanding of the project does not even mention this parcel. The traffic study does not adequately address ingress and egress or pedestrian circulation associated with this parcel. Caltrans does refer to traffic queues on State Route 12 from the off-site parking. In addition, I and my colleagues have found that most often there are as few as 5 to 10 vacant parking spaces on this site. Under CEQA, mitigation measures must be definitive, defined, and quantifiable so that their effectiveness is verifiable. As talked about earlier, mitigation measure Trans 6A, including curb extensions, bulb outs, enhanced signing, is speculative and unproven. Moreover, the traffic impacts are glossed over with assumptions such as, quote, the project is planned to be pedestrian-oriented by encouraging hotel guests to park their vehicles for the duration of their stay and walk or bike in and around the Sonoma Plaza area. The EIR does not address guests who don't bike, or how do guests get to outlying events and weddings and wine tasting in the Valley and Napa and other areas. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Gianna.
Good evening. My name is Sally Romer. I'm a resident here. I've lived in Sonoma for the past slightly over 20 years, and I teach in one of our local public schools. A couple of the things that I'm going to say actually were just said by the previous speaker, but they bear repeating, so pardon me for having the same thing spoken twice. My first concern is actually not about this revised EIR. It's about the original allowing a project to go forward when it's 4 parcels. 4 parcels rolled into one big project. To me, that leads us to a lot of the problems that are arising. It stem just from that. It makes it a huge project. And once we are allowing big ventures and businesses and hotels to come into Sonoma, then it changes the character of our community. That's my first concern. My second concern is the 50-50. If I understand it right, you are under obligation to make sure that there's 50% of the property being used is we're providing housing. 8 units of housing does not sound like 50% of 4 parcels to me. There are a couple of specifics in the environmental report. One, this was interesting to me as a teacher here in Sonoma. So when they were looking at the 50% housing alternative, I guess that means the 8 units, they say that there's a concern, there's an impact. And the impact is that there will be school-aged children living on the site, and it would increase student generation in the Sonoma Valley Unified School District. And that is seen as a negative. As far as I understand, we actually are needing to up our enrollment in the public schools. So it's concerning to me that even though the environmental impact report is supposedly objective, it's managing to find an increase in student population as a negative. The other concern that I have specifically from the EIR is that it's calling First Street West a collector street. A collector street is a street that links arterials to local streets and commercial and public destinations. I don't think First Street West is actually a collector street. I think it's a local street, and it's a neighborhood street, and that's concerning to me too, because given that designation, they can make specific statements about the impact report that aren't actually appropriate. I have one final comment, which is actually in response to someone else's public comment, just because it was spoken in terms of we, and I'm a part of the we in Sonoma, and I for sure do not need another hotel. I actually, as a resident of Sonoma, I need fewer hotels.
Thank you for your comments.
Good evening. George Thompson, 311 Nicole Lane. I've lived here for almost 40 years. I am also a commissioner. You guys should get on my commission. We hardly do anything. I'm on the art commission. There's never any people, never any comments. I've been against this. I end up like Larry Barnett a little bit right now. I'm pretty confused about the whole thing. Just the beginning of this whole commission meeting, I have a hard enough time expressing myself when I'm clear. So hold on to your horses here. I'm concerned about the 50-50 split. I'm wondering, will people buy those residential units? Or will they be rented by Kenwood Properties? Will they be the landlord? I don't understand that component. If they're for sale, I don't see any reason why rich people from San Francisco can't come up and buy them and have their own little place right near the plaza. That's kind of upsetting to me, that idea. I think they should really be designated as affordable housing. We do have a housing crisis in Sonoma. And our city council and our commission needs to acknowledge that. It's a serious problem. And so I'm a little concerned about I have a feeling that the 50-50 is going to be waived, and there's another plan in the works. There I go. I'm getting flustered here. Anyway, I'm concerned about the actual, if it does go 50-50, who actually owns or can afford those residential units. Will they be rented or will they be owned? And if they're owned, then they should be made to be affordable, because our workforce, of which I'm a part of, needs housing in this town. We really do. I know a lot of people that are even waiters and waitresses that commute to town just to work here. Anyhow, you guys might want to think about getting on my commission if you want less headaches. Thank you.
Thank you.
Logan Harvey, 578 Esmadera Drive. So it's very clear that we have a housing crisis in town. I went to get my hair cut the other day and started chatting with my hairdresser, and she was driving in from Sassoon City. I met a home care nurse while I was out canvassing, and she's driving in from Sacramento to take care of our elderly people. It's pretty clear to me that the way that this EIR has been produced is based on the assumption that the 50-50 is going to be waived, and that either the hotel whole hog or the hotel with just 8 rooms for residents is going to be what's approved. And it's a little shocking to me when this previously came up, the reasons that the housing was being waived was for economic benefits to the town. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Sonoma's not a coal town. We're not suffering from lack of economic activity. We bring in a bit of tourism every single year, and we do pretty well for it. What we do need is housing. And there's a reason that we write these things into our planning code. There's a specific reason that we do it, right? A half-acre commercial development is going to bring more employees. When we're talking about a hotel development, we're specifically talking about lower wage jobs. Lower wage people are not going to be able to live in this town unless we build adequate housing for them. If we continue to increase the amount of employees that we have in this town without increasing the amount of housing that we have for them, we're only going to increase the amount of traffic that's in this town, because people are going to continue driving in from Sassoon City and Sacramento. We're only going to continue to increase the amount of VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and greenhouse gases that lead to Sonoma being either the first worst or the second worst polluter in the county in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. If we don't follow the planning codes and building codes that we design specifically to mitigate these problems, and if we waive them for frivolous reasons, then what are we doing here?
This hotel is going to be, as the lady pointed out, a $600 a night plus room hotel. Now, most Sonomans families that come to visit them can't afford that. This is a luxury hotel. This is built for tourism, and that's okay. That's the backbone of our economy, largely, right? But we need to make sure that as we allow these developments to go through, that we're also doing what's required for the community, and that means the housing. And that means a 50-50 requirement. Why should we waive it? There isn't a good reason. Economic benefit is not a good enough reason. And I hope that you can consider that and recognize that when you have a project that's coming through that is required to have a 50-50 housing component, and it's not a put on by the Planning Commission, it's something that the Planning Commission can choose to remove, right? Which is an important distinction. They're supposed to have it, you can remove it. It's not you can add it on if it's needed, it's they're supposed to have it and you can remove it. So really think hard about why removing it, and really think hard why a project would come forward to you that is supposed to have something that has one option where it doesn't have it and another option where it doesn't really have it, and then just a paragraph or two about, oh, we could do it maybe, I don't know, this is probably about how many rooms we'd have. They're expecting for you to waive it. Don't.
Thank you, Logan.
My name's Gene Daly. I live at 753 3rd Street East. I want to start by first thanking you all for your service. It kind of sounds like you're in Iraq, but I'm sure some nights you go home and you feel that way. But I sincerely mean that. But the loss of David Goodison even gives you additional challenge of doing a great job. But I'm here tonight just to address one aspect of the project, and that's the housing at this location. I support low-income housing today, even more so. But this is not the right location or the right format. Starting with, I don't want to pay $500 a night, look across a breezeway, and see some guy with no shirt on, drinking a Corona, watching America's Got Talent. It doesn't work. I would not want to live at the project with my family. Where would my kids play? The tasting rooms? Steiner's would be a good place for them to hang out. And then possibly in the future, a marijuana store. That's not the place for your children to be. But low-income housing is a problem. It's your problem. It's my problem. But don't put our problem on a developer at the price of his success. What we should do in the real world, find a developer who will option a property across the street from the hospital, option a property across the street from the Mason Ave house, and help him get hooked up with a professional low-cost housing builder to build the perfect project for low-cost housing with little public play areas, little public meeting areas. That's the way to solve the problem, not at 4 rooms at a time. That's a Band-Aid. So if 4 units or 8 units of low-income housing works at this location, why not 100% low-cost housing at this location, at this focal point of the square? That ain't gonna fly. Just a quick raise of hands. Anybody on the commission been to the Archer Hotel in downtown Napa? Okay, nobody. Yeah, yes, sir, you been there?
Is that appropriate question?
No, it's not
Okay.
appropriate.
Okay, then I retract the question. Then I urge...
I've been there.
Okay. You look like it, I can tell. I urge you to go downtown Napa and visit the Archer Hotel. Valet parking, rooftop restaurant. Napa, Healdsburg, Yountville, they're doing something that Sonoma's not doing. And I urge you to remember, you are planners, not judges. And for Ms. Jensen, you asked a question beginning tonight. I will answer your question, Ms. Jensen, at the bar at the Sonoma Grill tonight, if you come. My treat. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good evening. Tom Conlon, 18850 Robinson Road. Speaking by myself tonight, for myself tonight. So I hear some comments about needing a hotel in town. And I remember when I spoke in favor of the lodge 24 years ago, feeling like we didn't have enough hotel space in town. Before my daughter was born, and my parents had to sleep on the floor because they couldn't find a room. I wanted to get up and thank the applicant tonight for their support of the revision after the city council had upheld the appeal. But when I looked over the revised draft EIR, I was surprised to not see the 50-50 alternative really fleshed out in any adequate manner. So I'm grappling as a longtime Sonoman. You know, my great aunt and uncle had a resort back in Boise at the turn of the last century. So I know tourism has been the anchor of our economy up here for over a century. But I'm grappling with the reality that our climate is changing and that tourism, especially air travel-based tourism, represents something like 10% of our global carbon footprint. And so when the consultant from PlaceWorks reported tonight that this EIR process is really just black and white, that we're just managing to a threshold, I find that is completely and fundamentally at odds with CEQA. CEQA does ask us to look beyond what those guidelines, what those bright line threshold guidelines might say. And that's actually the gist of the lawsuit that overturned the Sonoma County Climate Action Plan. And you have heard this at this commission before. New commissioners may not have heard this at the last time this came before you. But we know that this case is likely to end up in litigation over greenhouse gas impacts. For the consultant at this stage of the draft EIR to not address those and to simply retreat to that pro forma response is, I don't understand it. I'd be upset if I was the applicant for not actually addressing this issue properly. Now, I don't think it's impossible to address this issue. I do think that this is what CEQA is for. We are supposed to collect information, we're supposed to review the information, and then we're supposed to make adequate planning decisions. Commissioner Cribb's comment about the technical definition of the word requirement surprised me, because I think Logan Harvey made a good comment around that. That the reason that these things are in our planning code is that we need to do smart planning, and we have to have findings about why we're waiving those requirements. So with respect, I hope you would take another look at that as you consider this particular revised draft EIR. And then to the I'm going to have more specific comments, I hope. Hope I'll have time to put them together before the deadline, as I understand it, on the 13th. But to the earlier discussion that we began tonight with, Commissioner Jansen's questions, and I don't see how you can really adequately decide to consider this matter tonight until you have those questions answered, to have our staff be completely new, to have several of you be new members since this came before you last time, and to feel like we're on some kind of a quick deadline to make a proper decision on this. I would recommend that you continue tonight's meeting until the questions Commissioner Jansen asked can be adequately answered. We need to have some confidence in our staff. We need to have, I'd like to see the community come together around this project. I want to say that the applicant has done a lot to try to improve this project. And I think we can get there, but we do all need to get the information in front of us. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Tim.
Good evening, Commissioners. Chris Petlock, 426 Napa Road, Sonoma. I prepared some written comments. I'm not going to cover them all tonight, but I just wanted to touch on a few things that I thought would be important for you to hear in case you don't have the time to read through all of the comments. The first thing, as I read through this, I commute by this place at least twice a day, and many times get caught up in traffic, and a lot of times it has nothing to do with really the cars. It has to do with intermittent crossing of pedestrians there. And so as I read through this, I kind of read it from that point of view. I do really appreciate that the applicant has responded to this to the appeal and come back with a lot of good mitigations, but I still have some additional questions. And the first really surrounds the revised EIR, the language in there, and the report from Caltrans. The report from Caltrans suggests that there is irrevocable easement for 25 parking spaces in the Bank of Marin parking lot on the north side of the street. But the the analysis in the revised EIR suggests that this is for employee parking. These seem to be in conflict, where Caltrans seems to think this is to stop queuing for left-hand turns, while the EIR suggests this is for employee parking. So I just want to know, are these two items in conflict with each other? Would that, would Caltrans assessment or understanding of that parking space or those 25 spots change what Caltrans is going to expect on that route? The other thing I noticed in the traffic report, that it seemed like we were already at almost an unacceptable level for traffic there at that location. So with these additional, I think the report said a net 317 trips around in and out of that location. Why not just go ahead and put a left turn lane in there now, rather than wait until it's already a disaster and then go back and have to do additional construction in that area? Another concern I had regarding parking and traffic in that area is the request for a truck loading zone on First Street. I'm over there on First Street a lot. It's hard to find parking as it is. And my question is to you, what will a loading zone designated right there in that area do to parking right there on First Street West? My next questions really kind of surround greenhouse gases. This EIR pretty much said that greenhouse gases, it addressed greenhouse gases from construction, but it pretty much dismissed greenhouse gases from traveling vehicles, mile traveled related to this project, as insignificant. My concern is where did these vehicle miles traveled start from? I'd suggest that you go back and look at Riverwatch versus County of Sonoma. In that, Riverwatch successfully argued that vehicle miles traveled started countrywide. Was that used for this analysis? People coming to see the wine country obviously start somewhere. In that court case, they successfully argued that those vehicle miles traveled should start from their home, wherever that may be in the country. Thank you very much, Jerry. Or outside the country. I think those are very important points, and if this is to be considered into this, is greenhouse gases associated with this project still insignificant? Another thing that I missed or didn't find in this project was greenhouse gas inventory to kind of tell us or inform the public if in fact this is insignificant or if they're just dismissing it offhand. I think that these are very important points. Finally, hydrological impacts. I'm concerned about the holding tank. Whose responsibility is that? What processes are in place to oversee that tank? What plan is in place to monitor and detect future failure of that holding tank? what plan is in place to respond to a failure of that holding tank for, and this is for sewage water, I imagine, or water leaving that facility. And cost recovery, of course. What plans are in place to recover any costs should that holding tank fail? And finally, obviously, I think it's been mentioned a few times, there were no site plans for the 50/50 alternative for the public view. I think it'd be good if we could all see that, just so we can kind of get an understanding of what each of those alternatives might feel like. Thank you so
Chris.
much.
Thank you, Chris.
And
Good evening, Chair Felder, members of the commission. My name is Bill Willers. I live at 873 First Street West. I wasn't going to be here before you tonight, but I heard a previous speaker speak to the idea of living on the plaza. I was fortunate enough to live above what is now the Sunshine Cafe for the first 10 years that I lived in Sonoma, of the last 30 years that I've lived here. It was a fantastic experience. I got to live in the center of our town. I got to live in an affordable unit that was over a commercial space. It provided my firstborn the opportunity to play in the plaza every day. It provided me the opportunity to live with him while I worked and he played. It also provided the opportunity for my young son to greet people within this community every single day when he left our apartment. So I'll tell you what it's like to live in the middle of our town. It's fantastic. My two boys love this community, yet they can't afford to live here. My young son, my oldest son, now lives with us because he's trying to earn enough money to figure out where he can live in California. He's a graduate of NYU, has a degree in film, very bright, intelligent person, but can't afford to live in the community that he was raised in. So $500 a night rooms provide rooms for tourists. That provides income for our community, but it also generates a need for housing. The requirement of 50/50 is actually a balanced requirement, isn't it? 50/50. It trades income to our community through tourism for housing provided by the developer. I think that's a winning solution. That's always been a problem with this project from the very beginning, is that immediately took the position that the only thing it could provide to this community were $500 rooms a night. That was it. And it was going to ask you in return to grant it a waiver for that income. That's a problem. It's a problem we're facing throughout California, and it's an extreme problem in our community. Our Nexus study has pointed it out. And the reason that projects get appealed to you, I'll be quite honest with you, is because the due diligence and the environmental impact sequence of projects has not been done properly. If you vet this process, I don't believe that you can actually approve a document that doesn't analyze the 50/50 mix, because it is the primary project that's requested by our development code. We don't request 100% hotels in the commercial zone. We actually require a 50/50 mix of a project. And so unless this environmental document, instead of giving a couple of paragraphs of language to the 50/50 mix, actually evaluates it, you don't have a proper environmental document, and it will be appealed if you approve it. Do your due diligence. It takes time, it takes effort, and see if the project responds. If it doesn't, maybe we don't need the project.
Thank you, Bill. Is there anyone else that cares to speak?
Good evening, Michael Ross, architect for Hotel Project Sonoma. I want to thank you for your time, your patience, and your thoughtfulness on this. I know that It's been a long haul. And I'm here just to speak to a number of comments that arose tonight. First of all, as a 45-year resident of Sonoma, I don't believe that the 50-50 alternative really addresses a much deeper issue, or a deeper question is this the right spot for high-density housing? I don't think so. There's 7% of Sonoma's land is commercial. That's all. It's actually a rare breed of land use in our town. And so from that, these jobs that we talk about have to spring. And I don't really believe that applying the 50-50 determination, or actually your ability to make this decision about it, I don't believe applying it here is the right spot. And I think that there's better ways to do housing. I 100% support the need for more housing. But tonight, what are we doing? We're talking about the revised EIR and receiving comments purely about the merits of that document. And there's a few things that I'd like to describe. Why did the 8-unit alternative get studied, whereas the 50-50 didn't? It was really simple, because the 8-unit area that we found that could preserve the hotel in its current form had very severe code setbacks, vertical stacking requirements, and other features that needed to be tested before we could even propose it. And it was proposed as a partial waiver of the residential component, not as a solution. It was what would happen if we tried to do a both and on this. And so it was done in the spirit of trying to solve a problem. It wasn't done in the spirit of trying to create more impacts. It was, will it fit? Can we do that? Would this be a good spot to live that would be delinked from the hotel? Because I really think delinking the residential from a hotel is a better land use policy on this site, should, if and ever, this type of approach would be considered. Well, one of the first things we found that when you place the 8-unit model there, what happens? All of a sudden you lose the hotel's loading dock. There is a loading dock in this hotel, and there's a freight elevator, and there's a direct path to all of the support space in the basement garage. The proposal to do loading in the street like the Red Grape does, or like Steiner's does, or the Cheese Factory does, or many of the other, even Sebastiani Theater, is because it is a pattern that actually works, and it doesn't remove parking spaces. And it's a way for you can speedily unload a truck and not cross on a 90-degree and stop traffic, like when you see backing into Sonoma Market. So our approach on this is try to be as thoughtful listeners as we can. And what I've been hearing tonight is a fair amount of impassioned, subjective opinions, and that we've heard before over the past 7 years. We were first hired for this project in 2011. And the tenacity and patience of Kenwood Investments is really phenomenal. And their ability to listen is really phenomenal. And I know they're going to continue to listen. There is a letter from the law firm of Rose Zoya that has 7 different requests of the draft EIR. It's in the appendices of the document. And I won't go over each one of those 7, but if you, and that was the request of the appellants, every one of those items has been addressed in the current document. And if there's pieces missing or improvements to some of them, that may be true, but every one has been addressed. And so in that regard, the draft revised EIR is, from my point of view, it's comprehensive, it was methodical, and it did address what we're supposed to be doing here tonight, which is not to be judging the project based on the criteria of a conditional use permit.
I have to have you wind up.
But on the revised EIR draft itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone else? Last call. Seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing, bring it back to the commission for further discussion.
All right.
You may start, Commissioner Barnett.
Thank you, Chair Felder. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I bet you thought the most contentious hearing you saw today involved Judge Kavanaugh, but apparently it was here tonight. I want to make a few points about the concept of why we're here tonight about this EIR that I think needs to be reiterated. One can love the idea of a hotel at this location, yet think the EIR is flawed, and conversely, one can hate a hotel at this location but think this is a great document. And so the fact that we are sort of focusing, drilling down on this document, this is a process of state law, and if people have a problem with it, then we need to change the state CEQA law. But currently, this is what we need to do. It's a process of due diligence, and I think it's really important we get it right. In my view, a really strong, well-done EIR, I mean, it provides information so we can make a decision on the conditional use permit, and that helps the city and that helps this planning commission. But in my view, a real strong EIR, more than anyone else, helps the developer, because a weak EIR that's full of holes and flaws, like the EIR that was previously approved by this commission, will just get thrown out in court. And it seems like this is the type of project that could inspire litigation. And so, in my view, taking the time to really get this right now and producing a really good document will help Kenwood Investments. So, with that in mind, I want to focus on the revised EIR, because that's what we're supposed to do. I want to talk briefly about cultural resources, and these are my comments regarding cultural resources. My first comment is, well, I guess this sort of is connected to traffic as well, but I guess the question would be, and I don't know if you can answer it, but are there other mitigation measures that would satisfy bringing this under an adverse significant impact that are not bulb outs? And the reason why is because and I say this as someone that was on the Design Review and Historic Preservation Commission for a long time, reading the historic analysis for the effect of these bulb outs on the National Register District, I had some concerns with the conclusions of the analysis. First of all, when we say plaza, what do we mean? Do we mean the square in the middle and the buildings around it, or do we just mean the plaza in the middle, the park? And then when we talk about the plaza, and if we're just talking about the park, are we talking about the park, or are we talking about the sidewalks around it? Now, colloquially, I always assumed that the plaza, the square in the middle, also included the sidewalks around it. And I say that because in the document, it says enlarging the sidewalks and changing the shape of the curb line would change the geometry of the sidewalk, and the significance of a historic resource is materially impaired when it alters in an adverse manner the physical characteristics of a historic resource that convey its historic significance, which I am positing is the square. And obviously there was some stuff in the EIR and more in more detailed language in the National Register nomination form from 1992 about the law of the Indies. And the law of the Indies it pointed out that Sonoma is really one of the only places in California, or the last places in California, that has a intact law of the Indies layout. And in the law of the Indies, it specifically says that the plaza must be square or oblong, and in my view, just looking at an aerial with, and I'm not talking about the bulb outs on the west side, or there's only one bulb out that I'm concerned about, and it's the massive bulb out that will extend from the sidewalk on the plaza south, you know, where that tree is, sort of in the street, and it'll go all the way around. And in my view, just looking at an aerial, it will change the geometry of the plaza, which in my reading will be more than a significant impact. And so I bring this up because and in addition, if you read the historic analysis, when you're trying to determine whether or not an addition to a historic resource impairs it beyond a significant impact, it does say that if you follow the Secretary of Interior standards, that you're fine. And the Secretary of Interior standards specifically say no neck outs or bulb outs in historic districts. And so then it finds this other document that says it's okay, and then it shows some historic areas that do not allow bulb outs, and then it shows some historic areas that do. And to me, it sort of was like a jump ball. And I found it interesting that we sort of came down on it's okay. And so when it said it didn't rise to a significant impact beyond the Secretary of Interior standards, I just want that more fully fleshed out, because if, as I just stated, the square, based on the law of the Indies, it has to be square, I just don't know if you include the sidewalk in that square, if it remains geometrically square, and if that is a character-defining feature, I think we have an issue there. So I would like that more fully fleshed out, or perhaps I would like a peer review of this historic report, similar to the peer review that was done for the historic analysis on the Chateau Sonoma building. Got that? All right. So on the traffic and transportation section, I have a few questions and comments that hopefully can be addressed before the next meeting. So the trip generation model, I've actually had a lot of experience diving into traffic studies recently, and so I feel like I'm adept now at reading them. And the trip generation model, which I'm looking for, so it basically creates trip generations from the project and adds it to current real world conditions. That's how I read it. And I'm trying to find it. The current condition of, I'm sorry, I beg my pardon here. All right, anyway. So in calculating the trip generation model, it calculates first the trip generations by 62 rooms in the proposed uses, and then it subtracts the current generation for the existing uses to be removed, which is a 11,300 square foot warehouse building and a 3,500 square foot retail building. And the current use of that retail building is a single tenant office building. And I bring that up because the trip generation manual, the ITE manual, 10th edition, first of all, uses a shopping center category for that retail building. And in my view, I think is an inappropriate metric to use for that retail building, which was Chateau Sonoma, a nice, retail shop, but it's no longer there. But even if it still was there, in my view, it's not a sort of suburban style shopping center retail generating use there. And I printed out the generation rates from the ITE, and there are a lot of different other retail options that could have been selected than shopping center. But more to the point, I would replace it with what's currently there, because we're trying to calculate trip generation from what's currently there and subtracting it from what's currently there. And that is a single tenant office building. And I bring that up because the for example, it says retail, we're subtracting 134 daily trips. And in my view, there probably were not 134 daily trips when it was Chateau Sonoma, and I certainly don't think that there's 134 daily trips currently as Smashmallow, the single tenant office building that's there. And the ITE says that for the retail use, that's a 3.81 trips per 1,000 square foot. And for a single tenant office building, it is 1.74, which is a reduction of 54%, or it's 46% of what's there. And so I think that could, as you flush that out and flow it out, it's a significant, you're not removing as many trips. And so instead of net new trips of 364, it's actually 436. And so I don't know what that works when you flush it out, but I think that needs to be corrected. I would also like to add that I don't think there was in the EIR it says that they did not calculate trip generation separately for restaurants, because in the hotel analysis they assume that a restaurant is sort of part of a hotel. And I would argue that I don't know if that's the best way to look at it for this property. For one, the restaurant is, from what I understood, was going to be sort of like a destination restaurant. It's going to be right on Napa Street. It's sort of in a separate building from the primary hotel. And it's going to be the type of restaurant, I mean, it's not like the sort of like lobby restaurant, at the Walnut Creek Marriott. It's going to be the sort of type of restaurant that we want, that you're going to be visiting, which, by the way, I think is a great idea. I mean, it should be that type of restaurant. So what I would do two things. I would just take whatever the square footage of the restaurant is and apply a restaurant metric to that. And then there are other forms of hotel use metrics that you could potentially apply to the rest. They apply just hotel, but I know that there's resort hotel, there's another type of hotel, and there's been a lot of analysis that says that the hotel metric could be a little different as well. And so you might actually bring down the trip generation from the hotel. Some of the stuff I was reading said that you could do somewhere between 0.45 and 0.55 instead of the 0.6, so it'd be lower actually. But then the restaurant portion would be, quite frankly, much higher. So I don't know how that would all flesh out, but I do think the traffic analysis is flawed. Another question I would have is, it said that the analysis was conducted in May 2018, and I just want to make sure that's sort of a real-world condition analysis. I recently read an article in the Index Tribune that said we might be entering peak wine, and it included quotes from people that said tourism, and I've also heard this anecdotally, is down 20 to 30% this year, that there are lingering effects from the fires. And so I just want to make sure, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I just want to make sure that the May 2018 base data, which basically flows into everything and is so important, is not only right, but perhaps should be, a sensitivity analysis should be applied to it. I just want to make sure bike lanes with curb cuts are possible. I mean, the way I'm just envisioning it and looking at it, it's hard to imagine how a bike lane can go through that curb cut. And so I would like a graphic that shows a bike lane going through the curb cut or around it. So I know that that's under the condition of approval. I just want to see how that looks. I also want to talk about the concept of bulb outs. They're obviously used as, and that's why I asked if there's a way we can find another mitigation measure to satisfy keeping impacts under an adverse impact, et cetera. But I personally am not a huge fan of bulb outs, especially at this location, just in general, and I could be convinced otherwise. But I think the way that the crosswalks are there, I think at least, especially people that live here, they sort of, if you're at City Hall and you're trying to get to the Chateau Sonoma building or Whole Foods, for example, you might cross somewhere else and then cross sort of, in front of that corner 103, you generally try to avoid those long crosswalks between Bank of America and the plaza. And so when you sort of bring them closer together, obviously it reduces the time pedestrians take to cross, but it also, in my view, might create like a magnet where it'll be much easier, and now more people will be crossing there, and that could have some potential impacts. I know that the crosswalks by the Mission and the crosswalks by Girl and the Fig tend to really create traffic backups because they're so close together, and people start using them diagonally, and if we do create a very attractive pedestrian crossing area here by really bringing them close together, that's great for the pedestrians. I'm just wondering if the effect on the traffic and the way it could back up to Broadway and other ways has been fully evaluated in this. And and it could be, and I might be missing it, but I just would like to learn maybe more how they calculate the pedestrian calculations in these crosswalks. And then the mitigation measure about a transit pass, I don't know if that's common or okay, but it struck me as at some level ridiculous that we're going to give you a transit pass to get around some mitigation measure when we don't really have the kind of public transit in Sonoma that I think these kind of mitigation measures were designed for. And on the weekend, a bus comes every hour to hour and a half, and it only goes certain places on the weekend. And even during the week, it doesn't. There are no buses that go to Napa or Fairfield or Vallejo, which earlier a public commenter said a lot of our workforce seem to be coming from currently. And so, I just want to. That just struck me as a strange mitigation measure, and it might satisfy some state requirement, but I just think a real-world condition, it's not the greatest mitigation measure. And so, when it comes to the 50-50 housing and all that, in my view, that's a use permit discussion. Tonight, we're just talking about the EIR, and I don't think that it was discussed in the EIR, but I think that's ultimately up to the Planning Commission, and then most likely the City Council decide whether or not to waive that. It doesn't strike me as an environmental issue. The one thing I would like to say, in terms of like building more hotel rooms and everything, I, in general, happen to believe that, Sonoma could have more hotel rooms. I mean, I'm not against the concept of a hotel rooms in general, or even here. But we have to sort of apply the municipal code and the general plan and use this EIR and understand compatibility and everything. And so I don't think, and I appreciate all the comments from both sides about that, I just don't think it's not an environmental EIR discussion topic. The one thing I brought up at the beginning of the meeting I want to emphasize again is the aesthetics. I think that it would be when we're hearing the full EIR, it would be beneficial to the commission and to the public at large, and ultimately the developer, to have better aesthetics. And I don't mean, because in a way I actually want to avoid a situation where story polls are called for at the last minute. When I think, from what I've seen it actually, the technology exists where you can do really good 3D renderings that really provide a just total and accurate view of how the project is going to look. And the photos in the earlier EIR and some were reproduced here, in my view, don't really rise to the level of providing the Planning Commission the type of information we need to evaluate aesthetics. And that's ultimately what the EIR is information, so we can make a better decision on the use permit. So, in general, those are my comments, and I would like to hear what the rest of the commission has to say.
Want to keep coming down the line? Carol?
I'm fine. I'll go if nobody wants to take a shot at it. Sorry about this. Thank you very much. I wanted to again thank the public for coming out and helping add to the discussion of the revised draft EIR, and also the thoughtful comments that we'll hear from the Planning Commission, and for staff and the applicant and his patients. I understand that we're supposed to focus our comments on the EIR and environmental impact. So please excuse me if I do stray from the practicality of use versus the sheer environmental issues that we need to assess as part of this process. This is also will help maybe put to rest some of my original concerns that I still feel like it hadn't been addressed when I was sitting here a year ago and we were looking at the last EIR. So I'm going to go through these on point by point. So bear with me. The first has to do with the parking lot. The parking lot at the Bank of Marin. And my understanding with the application is that we need the parking lot because we would need 5 to 7 parking spaces, and a variance would be required. And that has a little bit to do with the use issues, the use permit issues, but it also has to do with the practicality of people using the property for a higher commercial use. And so the parking lot in and of itself is an issue, and I consider it also an environmental issue as it relates to CEQA. One of the criteria, or one of the things that the city has to analyze are land use impacts. And one of the findings in an EIR has to do with land uses that commit future generations to a particular condition, so to speak. And the project, for all intents and purposes, involves the creation of a surface parking lot across the street. It creates a potential underutilized property with surface parking or parking for another use that's not on site. And this creates a land use change for the Bank of Marin site. And although the site is currently a parking lot, it does commit future generations to this particular land use, and it marginalizes the site that could otherwise be redeveloped with, say, a pedestrian-oriented building providing housing and mixed use, which is the vision of our general plan, our zoning code, and our design guidelines. We also, in the spirit of this, have created specific design guidelines in the downtown which discourage surface parking lots along our retail corridors and in the core of the downtown. And so what I would hope is that the EIR does not really discuss this. It doesn't discuss the impacts associated with creating a more marginalized property across the street for the purposes of creating the hotel. And I believe that CEQA and the EIR should address that. So I'm hoping that there can be better discussion in the EIR as it relates specifically to the Bank of Marin site and the creation of that surface parking lot in perpetuity, or until, I don't know really. I would assume that it would be in perpetuity. So I wanted a discussion of that. The other issue Commissioner Barnett brought up has to do with aesthetics, and I just wanted to kind of add to that. And I guess this is my opportunity to talk about the visual simulations and the analysis that was done on the previous EIR and what has been added with respect to the housing component. I agree with some of the discussions from members of the public with respect to this being in our historic district and having a historical town plat with a historic pattern of small lots and in a historic setting. And I believe that to understand the consolidation of the 4 lots and to fulfill the development proposal, we need to have a better comparative model to show the surrounding environment as it relates to this development. It's really not clear, at least to me as a commissioner, how this project compares to the context of the plaza. I see some of the visual simulations as it would relate to a pedestrian walking down the street, but I still don't understand its context with respect to the plaza. And I know that there is a separation between this site because the site is not technically in the National Historic Register, but I still believe that to get a better understanding and to be able to move forward in consolidating these lots, a better visual simulation should take place. In particular, I believe that this simulation for the residential, the new residential units is inadequate. It would also, if that was a free standalone project, we probably want to see visual simulations from different vantage points as opposed to just the plaza, because it in and of itself would need to meet the tests of our design guidelines, our own environmental review of that as it would stand alone. I also wanted to discuss some issues as it relates to the traffic analysis, as it relates to the restaurant component. And Commissioner Barnett had brought up the whole issue about a restaurant as a destination versus accessory to the hotel. And in the original EIR, it assumed there would be 24 employees per shift. But if you take a look at some of the freestanding restaurants and also some of the restaurants that are currently operating on the plaza, such as the El Dorado Hotel, there are more than 24 employees per shift that function right now on the plaza. And so it might be also helpful to look at comparative to a hotel that we already have on the plaza, like the El Dorado, to look at the employees that actually it generates, because it would be of similar size and caliber, I believe. And it also is in conjunction with the hotel. I think also that would be the most conservative approach and would lay to rest any sort of issues with the restaurant component. One of the other issues as it relates to housing element component of the project, and also mitigation, and also alternatives that we're looking at, has to do with providing housing either on-site or off-site. And I think I had brought this up at one of the previous public hearings, and I can't remember which one because we've been going through these for several years now. I can't remember if it was when I was part of the Design Review Commission. I mean, because I wasn't part of the Design Review Commission when we were looking at the design component. But regardless, one of the original project applications included the Lynch building that was to be demolished, and then another iteration of the project came that retained the Lynch building. But regardless, the Lynch building already has, I believe, 7 apartment buildings on the 3rd floor. It has a floor plate in the center that was originally designed for 7 apartments. It has the open space, the balconies, and the functioning aspects to allow for apartments. Right now is the Pacific Union Real Estate Office, but this is a building that is controlled and owned by the applicant and the partners, and there is an opportunity to look at that floor plate, that middle floor plate, as a potential mitigation and also a conversion that would allow housing within the downtown. And I wouldn't want this process to move forward unless we looked at that seriously as a viable option. And I would encourage, and moving forward, that we look at that. I think that would be something that would really facilitate housing within the downtown, and wouldn't necessarily require any construction outside of the parameters of the development. And in that vein, one of the mitigation measures to reduce trip generation and a whole series of other environmental issues has to do with employee visits to the site, and one of the mitigation measures are bus passes and bike parking and locker rooms. But one thing that hasn't been discussed at all with the 8-unit development or the 50% ideas, but a mitigation that would look at actually the developer or being required to or offering housing for employees that work on site, which would be a win-win, and it would be a real mitigation measure that would have real consequences by reducing trips by employees, and would be a full faith effort in satisfying some of the real true impacts that SEEK was supposed to be looking at. So I'd like to see if that is possible, and we could have that discussion. The other issue that I grappled with the last time has to do with the loading docks, and with the addition of the 8 units off of First Street West. It exacerbates an already, I would consider, a poor issue with truck parking and loading and unloading off of First Street West. It is a collector neighborhood street that has been superimposed with some loading. I believe that it may not be appropriate to add to this already existing condition, because it is a little bit different than the true commercial streets that you see along the plaza where we allow loading and unloading. And so I still have concerns or reservations about the loading along First Street. And the last issue has to do with the bulb out. I know Commissioner Barnett also discussed the bulb out as it relates to the historic and cultural analysis. The discussion is confusing and doesn't offer it doesn't offer it provides confusion and doesn't offer a clear, concrete resolution. And I believe that I agree with Commissioner Barnett, and I believe that an independent peer review should be required to look at that bulb out as it relates to the historic resource and district of the plaza itself. And I think that would be very helpful to also have. So hopefully these comments are helpful and useful as it relates to the environmental issues that are before us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Felder. I think this is a fine location for a hotel. I've talked to some hoteliers around the last few months, and I think there's a consensus with the residents and the other hotel owners that we could use another hotel here in town. I think this is a good location. It's accessible. That part of Napa Street is not congested at this point and not highly densely used compared to some other locations. But I think we really need to get this right. It's a fairly big project and an important part of near the square. Some of my concerns, I think the separate parking lot on across the street on Napa Street at the Marin Bank has some questions about it. There's going to be pedestrians crossing back and forth. I don't think you can stop that, walking back and forth. Let's not forget that that is a state highway, and some people treat it that way. They're moving pretty quickly down there. Sometimes you got to be pretty fast on your feet to get across that intersection on First Street, from the Taub Place over whether you're going down to Pete's or something. That's a busy street. And I think the other issue to remember is that there are half a dozen very popular restaurants right around the corner up First Street West, starting with the Harvest Moon going up to the depot. There's virtually no parking for any of those places. Steiner's has got 10 spaces. Go up to the depot, they've got 10. There's hundreds of seats with no parking, and to some extent, that's kind of amorphous. Everybody moves around, tries to grab the parking spaces, and they'll drive down in front of this hotel sometimes too, trying to get parking spaces. So those are kind of overlying mood issues that might suggest we need to be rigorous with the mitigation issues. When you start to get to the threshold of mitigation issues, which it appears we are in on this left-right turn warrant study, and I'm not bright enough to truly understand all the details of that, but it appears that we're close to a threshold of needing that. We should be careful about just coming up short and not doing something that's going to be worthwhile to mitigate the traffic and the parking issues, because we've got a really important sector of town we're dealing with. I share Commissioner McDonald's concern about lowering the potential utility of the Marin Bank site, even though it's owned by the principals. I haven't heard anybody suggest that we try and expand the underground parking garage to account for more, but I think it would be good to have the answer to that. Can it be done so that we don't have to squeeze all these? Some of these mitigations appear to an amateur like me to be somewhat speculative, and I don't like getting so close to the thresholds of need. So if we could expand the underground parking, that would eliminate that mystery. There's always a difference between the intellectual idea of a mitigation working and after it's in action. Is it really going to work? We can't go back after it's done. Moving over to the suggestion of the eight residential units. That sounds like a fine idea on the surface of it, but I was having a hard time in the beginning with the on-street large truck loading in the middle of First Street West. And I think the Lodge is a good example of something we've lived with. We went through that Lodge park in the street business with the Altamira project, and I think it was very clear to me that should never have been allowed, because what it's done to the Lodge, the Marriott Corporation, is to take city property and using it at the behest of Marriott, where they should have had that inside, have been paying for that using land area within the hotel for that loading dock. And I can't agree that a loading dock will, when the trailer is passing off the street and into the dock, I don't think that there's a significant blocking of traffic. A good over-the-road truck driver can back it in a couple of minutes. And a 40 or 50-foot trailer takes a long time to load. The simile being used as well for having loading like we have around the square, I don't think that is a good analogy anymore, because the only reason those trucks are in the middle of First Street East and West is because those buildings were built for horse-drawn carriages. It was 150 years ago, and that's the only reason why they don't have loading docks. So I objected to the parking in the street on First Street West for big trucks. They had their smaller box vans and panel trucks inside at another loading dock was mentioned. I understand that. But by putting the 8 housing units in that spot, all of the trucking goes out in the street. I don't think that works for First Street West. And I'm not parsing whether it's a collector or a neighborhood street, but I walk down there several times a week, and it's a quiet street. And I don't think the Red Grape's going to appreciate having all of the loading for this project in the front of their operation. I might be guilty of conflating the EIR issues with the project issues, but just to comment on the 50-50 arrangement, I kind of like the concept of reducing the rooms and having a reasonable residential component. But I don't think this is the time to really evaluate that because there's not really much to review and talk about. And I posed a question about whether the housing component, some housing component could be off-site and not. Commissioner McDonald's comment I thought was very worth studying about the Lynch building, pushing out the 2 floors of commercial and making that housing. I like that idea, but I think if it's possible, considering some off-site location, I'm minorly involved in a hotel development down in San Luis Obispo called the San Luis Obispo Hotel. It's going to open up in January. They have an off-site affordable housing project that's totally away from the hotel project, and it turns out it was a apartment project in not very good condition that they purchased and renovated and turned into affordable housing. Perhaps there's an opportunity, realizing that we don't have that big an apartment stock, but perhaps something like that could be considered. Moving over to the intersections, the 3 or 4 intersections we're looking at, I thought the idea of testing the bulb outs and the bows was a very good idea. I do have some concerns about it, how it's going to squeeze down the traffic. Remember, it's a state highway going through there, not a side street. There's also a potential clash with the potential installing bike lanes on Napa Street. That's part of the bicycle network. Unfortunately, a side comment, the bicycling network is very nicely developed, but it's not executed in a significant way. And if we expect to put 2 lanes of bikes on West Napa and we've got the bulbs, I see that as a real congestion problem and a risk problem for bicyclists. Did I understand that the valet parking was free or not? Can I ask that question?
I don't think it fits.
I'm sorry?
I don't think it's germane.
Okay.
We can get the answer to that and put it in the staff report when the merits come before you.
I can pass on that. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just have a few short things, and I want to clarify in response to the comment. My question about the housing thing was because in the original request from the City Council, they asked us to look at different housing opportunities, and I wanted to make sure that we were not legally locked into one of those, because they had the look at like 8 to 12. And that, and maybe it's not 8 to 12, and maybe it's not 50-50, but maybe it's 60-40, 70-30, or something. That there does not have to be. It's either A or B. That there's options. On the issue of, I know one of the things we consider, and there's been a lot of talk about, the traffic and the trucks and those things, and we're asked to in the EIR, you look at the sort of cumulative effect of, what's the impact of other projects that might come down how does this fit to that? Is it appropriate to also look at the sort of more historical arc? Because I know I brought this up in earlier hearings. I mean, when that was a printing plant, there were a lot of trucks. I mean, I remember, the paper trucks coming in every day to deliver papers for the IT to be printed, and the newspapers going out, and the magazines, and the various things that they printed. And so if we're also looking forward, or we're also looking back, because there's been a lot of lost truck traffic in that area over the years historically, that it's not like this is just a single point in time when we talk about traffic or things. Likewise with the restaurant. I mean, we've lost a 100-seat restaurant in Rennes a few years back that has not been replaced on the plaza. So there's 100 restaurant seats that had been used that aren't. So I don't know if it's appropriate in doing a traffic analysis or an impact analysis that if you're trying to look into the future, can you also consider potentially what's been the sort of historical arc of that? And to kind of echo the comments from Commissioner Barnett and McDonald on the plaza and the bulb outs, but also to have a little different perspective, I guess I feel like we do have some precedents of bulb outs in this community. I know there's some right across from the community center, for example, to shorten the crossing there, and those have been in there for quite a number of years now. We're not the only community in the world to actually ever have had bulb outs. So I think the concept is a proven concept. It doesn't really need to be, we don't have to test it out to see if it works. And even more so for me than just another peer review, I don't know, because it's kind of like a little bit of what we got in the EIR, but just more of a kind of an argument about what is the character defining feature. I mean, if you just look at some of the photos in this room of the plaza over the years, what is the character defining, because it certainly looks a lot different today in how the street appears and how the plaza appears and how the plaza relates to the space around it. So I'd rather just see some sort of multiple interpretations of that rather than here's one person's opinion and then here's another person's opinion. I'd like to look at a broader spectrum of considerations about, so would something like bulb outs actually impact that? Or is that not really what because that's kind of where and because I think it is important that, and I've talked about this in a number of projects, because that's one of the main reasons that traffic is bad around the plaza. That's part of our circulation element. That's part of our design. And it's to put pedestrians first. And so I'd like to see a little more in-depth analysis of that impact versus the historic character and what makes up the defining character of our plaza. And I think for me that's pretty much it.
I'm going to keep my comments very short this evening. I came principally to listen to the public's comments, and part of it is driven by the fact that I did not have the luxury of participating last year in the EIR review. So to that, I'm going to take the advantage of what the public has right now until September 13th, and I'm going to reflect both on tonight as well as further review and forward on my comments via writing.
Carol?
Just a very quick comment, okay? I think that commissioners, especially Commissioners Barnett and McDonald, have done a really thorough analysis of the EIR, so I have no comments on the EIR. Frankly, I think the fact that it took from April of last year to now September of this year to get back to the Planning Commission is astonishing to me. And so I just think that what we have to deal with here, this is a political decision. It's a land use decision, okay, before the Planning Commission, but it's a political decision, because I don't think anybody up here thinks it's not going to land in the consul's lap, regardless of what, Jim Reese, you might tell me about what may or may not go to City Council, okay? I think this is going to happen, and so I think that's what we need to focus on is what do we want best? From my perspective, I think that it's very hard to integrate residential with hotel. And if you don't want a hotel, then you have to tell the Chamber of Commerce and the Visitors Bureau, who are actively soliciting people to come to this town because they make money from it, okay, that you don't want it anymore. Otherwise, you know, a hotel keeps them here and it keeps them overnight, and they don't have to drive anywhere. So I guess I'm just kind of befuddled about all of this, and I think it's a fundamental decision that we as a planning commission can make as a recommendation of the city council, whether or not it has to be a recommendation or whether it's a final decision, but I don't think it's going to be. All right? And so I wish us all the best, and I think my commissioner's comments are very, very solid.
Thank you, Carol. A lot of what I'd like to speak on has already been covered, but I would like to at least get my viewpoint in the record. And I'd like to kind of go through the items that came out of the appeal that the city council directed that this revised draft EIR should include. And I'm not going to hit them topic by topic, but I will try to hit some points that I think are particularly important. I should preface it with a general comment that I was disappointed that there wasn't more factual data in the EIR, given the time that it took to prepare it. I will try to highlight some of those specific areas rather than just being general, but I think it could have done a better job. I'm also disappointed in language where it says something should be done as opposed to something shall or must be done. And certainly by the time we get to a use permit, if it's a condition of approval, it's not going to make it by me unless it says must. Let's just go through a few things. Traffic and transportation. I think that, as it is pointed out by some of the other commissioners, specifically Commissioner Barnett, this trip generation thing perhaps needs to be reworked. And that's important because I think we were right on the ragged edge of figuring out whether a left turn lane was required in that left turn warrant analysis. That, coupled with the fact that when I looked at what was done, included in this draft version of the EIR, it didn't really include any contribution in terms of quantitative data from the parking lot across the street. And that parking lot across the street creates two potential left turn lane going into that parking lot, as well as the interference with the left turn lanes trying to get into the hotel complex directly. So that it isn't obvious to me that that left turn analysis was done completely enough for finding out if it was required to do something. Large truck deliveries. I think that the approach in this draft version totally underplayed the impact that exists on First Street West with large trucks. It is not a collector street, it is a residential street. And we only have to look, as another commissioner brought up, to the example of the lodge to find out the problems that can be created by using the street as a loading zone. So at least we should consider, when we're looking at alternatives, that we don't eliminate a loading dock as part of the project. The area, the parking lot across the street. Not only is it potentially adding to the left turn warrant analysis, but there is a significant issue, I think, with pedestrian safety, because there is no traffic light in the immediate vicinity, and cutting across the state highway by pedestrians is looking for an accident to happen. Talking about bow outs or curb bow out conditions, I have a couple of issues there. First of all, to me, bow outs in bicycle lanes, especially what is projected to take place on West Napa Street, is a Class 2 bike lane, which means a separate lane in each direction for bicycles that the traffic is not allowed into it. To try to create that space and have bulb outs doesn't seem to be compatible, and it really wasn't addressed. There was a number of times that this EIR talked about bicycle traffic as being a necessary component, but then it was never really addressed on how it would be implemented, given the fact that we were looking at bulb outs. That, together with there seems to be a conflict with different historic resources on whether bulb outs are appropriate or not in a historic district. And so I think that information has to be fleshed out in more detail too, to come to a conclusion that is supportable with some data. That's probably bringing me down to the alternatives. The City Council requested an analysis of an expanded range of alternatives. And to me, analysis requires more than a couple of paragraphs that say, well, let's try for a 50-50 thing, so many rooms here, so many rooms there, with no backup, no meaningful data that shows how it might be accomplished. And perhaps you could move one step closer to project approval and get through an EIR, but there's no way that you have a way to make a judgment about whether that alternative is even feasible. And for us as a commission to make an allowance for a waiver to take away the residential component, I think we need more factual data, more definition of what these alternatives are, and I think that's what the council was asking for, and I don't think this EIR delivered it. So really, I think in summing it up, I think there were a number of serious issues raised by both the public and the commission on areas that still haven't been addressed to the degree we think they should be. And I think it's imperative that as the consultant goes back and responds to the questions and comments, that is done thoroughly and with enough time to be a very complete discussion, so that we don't run into the same situation when we come to an October meeting where we don't have the data we need to make a decision. And with that, I'm going to conclude my comments. So I think we move on from this one, and there are no items for discussion that are listed on our agenda. So we're at an issues update. Jim, if you have any issues that you care to present?
I have nothing this evening, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so we will then wind it up with other comments from the commission, which we have continued from the first part of the meeting. So anyone that would like to join in with comments at this point, and certainly Linda, now is your time to speak.
I just wanted to, I'm a bulldog with a bone, and I just wanted to bring up the special subcommittee that I would like to see happen to deal with parking and transportation. I understand that there is a transportation commission, but I would like us as a body to make a recommendation to City Council that such a committee be created. We have to find 400 parking spots in this town in a few years, and I think we need to get started.
Thank you. Anyone else? I have one comment that I'd like to also add. We had this discussion during the initial comments that perhaps there would be a special meeting that could be called to discuss what's been going on in town. So I'm going to ask the staff to go back and have a conversation with the city manager and whatever legal input you need to decide whether there's something meaningful that can be done to inform the Planning Commission of how we got here and how we're going forward. Because I think we need to have a solid base to work from, and we're very concerned that until we get the appropriate staff in place, it's going to be very difficult to do that. So if there's any way we can have some kind of special meeting to have that discussion, I'd appreciate that.
Can I
Yes.
follow up on that? I mean, just to sort of echo that and sort of echo Commissioner Jansen's comments earlier, we have a lot going on in Sonoma. This is a critical time. And I mean, I want to get these projects, you know, I want to move forward. I want to approve projects, and I want to make sure they're not overturned at the city council level. And that really requires, I think, a planning department. And we don't seem to have one, with all due respect. I mean, our planning department is, I think what Commissioner Jansen was trying to say earlier is this, it's just an unfortunate, I guess, time to not have a planning department besides Wendy, basically, and Christina, you know, when all these very significant sort of almost generational projects are before us. And so whether that's a special meeting or I don't know what there is, but I really think it will serve everyone better if we can sort of shore up whatever's going on in the planning department.
If I may, Chair Felder, I think part of the issue with trying to respond to that is that we're not really involved in where the city is with the interviewing process and recruitments, et cetera. So I think the person who can inform you of that is, in fact, the city manager and give you sort of an update. Where are we? What's the expected timeline? That type of a thing. Now, whether that needs a special meeting or whether that can be done in a memorandum to all of you, or whether it can be a section of your next meeting where that item is just on the agenda for update of where we are in the process. We can pass that on to her and let her
I would
respond
appreciate
to
you
you.
just going back and trying to, you know, have some resolution to get us out of this fix.
Exactly. And I know it's being worked on. I just, neither of us can really represent that status at this point. I don't think we're just not the right people to respond to that question.
I'd like to just reemphasize that it's not only important for us commissioners to kind of know what's going on, but I think it's also important that the public know, because we're in a very awkward situation right now. And part of that awkwardness is the people out in the chairs are holding us accountable. And right now we feel like we're just floundering to some degree. So I think it's extremely important that you communicate that to city manager and say that it's imperative that some format that's legal be set up so that it can be jointly educated as far as what's going on.
And I think we will definitely communicate that to her tomorrow and get back to the commission. Someone will get back to the commission with what's the best format to address the commission's questions with regard to how are we moving forward and what the timeline looks like in the process.
And just one more point to that point in the timeline and scheduling. I don't know if the CEQA consultant has left, but based on the public's input and the commission's input, do you think October 4th, tentatively scheduled, is realistic?
you know,
Let's say October 3rd.
yeah,
Sorry,
let's get that
October.
right.
Right.
We can certainly circle back with him tomorrow or later this week and make sure that he thinks, in light of the comments we've received to date, both in written and oral form this evening, as well as anything that comes in. Obviously, there's still more time for other things to come in. So it's hard for, I think, us to evaluate. He certainly didn't say anything before he left, but we will check in with him. If for any reason it appears that that's not doable, given the commission's comments in particular, then we'll look at getting back to the commission about rescheduling.
Yes, because I don't want us to go forward with a failure as a likely outcome.
Right. So we understand that.
I think, well, yeah. I mean, I think we want to be able to certify something if that's going to be what, at least in the past, has been staff's recommendation, certify this document. And so, you know. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, just one more addition. There were a couple of comments this evening about the timing on the environmental document, and though that item has passed, a lot of the time was taken up by trying to make sure that additional traffic counts were done during appropriate times. So that took a lot of time. Just wanted to let the commission know that.
Thank you. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous.
Yeah.
I swear to God, I've never had an offer like that.
I know. From the podium.
Oh, funnier now.
Yeah.
Oh, well. What can we say, right?